Hello and welcome to our quiet sanctuary of history. I am so glad that you have chosen to be here with me tonight. Before we begin our journey into the past, I have a small question for you. Where are you watching this from right at this moment? And what time does the clock show in your part of the world? If you share this in the comments below, it would bring me such joy to read them. It connects us across the miles and across the hours. And if you have not yet subscribed to our channel, doing so would make me very happy and help our community grow. But now, it is time to let go of everything else. Leave the exhaustion of the day far behind you. Let your shoulders drop down and let your jaw relax completely. There is no rush here, only the slow, rhythmic tide of history. Allow yourself to drift like a ship floating on a calm, glass-like sea. We are about to embark on a voyage that changed the shape of the world forever. But have you ever wondered what truly pushes a man to sail into the void? What does the edge of the known world look like in the mind's eye? Is it fear that stops us at the shore, or curiosity that pulls us forward? Tonight, we seek the answers in the salt spray and the whispering wind. Imagine the world before the maps were complete, a world of shadows, monsters, and endless blue mystery. Can you feel the rough wood of the ship's deck under your feet? Can you smell the scent of old canvas and heavy tar? The year is 1492, and the world is holding its breath. We are standing on the precipice of a new age, and the man who will lead us is staring intently at the sea. In the bustling port city of Genoa, a dangerous dream was born, not in a grand palace, but in the mind of a simple wool weaver's son. Young Christopher Columbus watched the ships come and go every day. Their white sails were like clouds, drifting slowly toward the horizon. He wondered where the sun went when it dipped into the water at dusk. The Mediterranean was a busy lake of trade and noise and voices, but his eyes were always fixed on the west, on the silence there, where the waters turned dark and deep and unknown. The library of his mind was filled with ancient texts and rumors. He read the words of Marco Polo, describing cities paved with gold, Chipangu, Cathay, names that tasted like exotic spices on his tongue. The candle on his desk would burn low, flickering in the sea draft. Shadows danced on the stone walls, like the waves he longed to conquer. He traced the lines of Ptolemy's map with a rough, calloused finger. The parchment was brittle, yellowed by time and by hope. Everyone said the East could only be reached by going east. The land route was long, dangerous, and full of bandits. But Columbus saw a circle where others only saw a straight line. If the world was truly round, as the ancients whispered in secret, then the West must be the hidden back door to the East. It was a simple thought, yet it was madness to speak it aloud. The ocean was not a road. It was a terrifying wall, a barrier of storms, and endless, deep nothingness. Yet, The idea took root in his heart, heavy and firm like an iron anchor, and he could not pull it up, no matter how hard the winds of doubt blew. He knew that a dream without a ship is only a ghost. To cross the dark ocean, he needed wood, canvas, and gold. He needed the might of a crown to back his wild wager, so he turned his face toward the court of Portugal. King John II sat upon a throne of carved velvet. The room smelled of beeswax candles and heavy perfume. Columbus unrolled his charts upon the long oak table. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from passion. He spoke of islands filled with pearls. He spoke of the great Khan and roofs tiled with gold. But the king's geographers stood in the shadows. They whispered to one another with thin, skeptical smiles. The ocean is too vast. They murmured softly, no ship can hold enough water for such a voyage. They called his calculations a fantasy, a fool's errand. The king shook his head, and the heavy doors closed. Rejection is a cold wind that chills the bones. Columbus gathered his maps, rolling them tight like secrets. He took the hand of his young son, Diego. They walked away from the rich palaces of Lisbon. The road to Spain was long, dusty, and hard. The sun beat down upon their weary shoulders. His boots were worn, the leather thin against the stones, but his eyes remained fixed on the western horizon. They arrived at the gates of a quiet monastery, La Rábida, standing lonely on a cliff overlooking the sea. The wind here smelled of salt and pine needles. It was a place of silence and deep, slow thought. He knocked on the heavy iron-bound door. The sound echoed, hollow and loud in the stillness. A monk, with a kind and weathered face, opened the gate. Friar Antonio saw something in the stranger's eyes, not madness, but a burning, steady light. They sat in the cool shadows of the stone courtyard. A fountain trickled nearby, a soothing, liquid sound. Columbus spoke again of the sphere of the world. He drew lines in the dust with a dry twig. The monk listened as the afternoon light turned to gold. He did not laugh at the weaver's son. He saw the geometry of God in the man's words. "You must go to the queen," the monk whispered. "Queen Isabella of Castile, the warrior queen." But Spain was a land of iron and blood. The war against the Moors was raging in the south. The court was not a place of peace, but a camp of war. Tents of silk and canvas stretched across the plains. Columbus would have to wait while the cannons roared. He became a ghost in the court, waiting in the wings, watching the seasons change, while his hair turned gray, holding his dream close, like a candle in a storm. 7 years is a long time to wait for a single word. Columbus followed the court from city to city. He was a beggar of kings in a cloak that was turning threadbare. But in January of 1492, the world shifted on its axis. The great city of Granada, the last stronghold, finally fell. The silver cross was raised high above the Alhambra's red towers. The air was filled with the ringing of bells and the smell of victory. King Boabdil wept as he handed over the heavy iron keys. The war was over, and the silence of peace descended. Now, Queen Isabella could turn her eyes to the ocean. She summoned the Genoese sailor to the city of Santa Fe. It was a city built of tents and stone. In the dust of the plain, Columbus walked into the royal pavilion, his head held high. He did not look like a beggar now, but like a visionary. He asked for 3 ships to sail the dark sea. He asked to be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He asked for 1/10 of all the gold and spices he found. The courtiers gasped at his arrogance. "Who is this commoner," they whispered, "to demand so much?" The treasurer of the crown looked at the queen. "The cost is small," he said softly, "if the prize is a world." Isabella looked deep into Columbus's eyes. She saw the fire that had burned for all those lonely years. She saw a faith that mirrored her own. "I will do it," she said, and her voice was clear as a bell. "I will pledge my jewels for this enterprise." The words hung in the air, shimmering like dust motes in a sunbeam. Columbus felt a weight lift from his weary soul. The waiting was over. The dreaming was done. Now, the doing had to begin. The capitulations of Santa Fe were signed on parchment. The ink was black and wet and binding. He left the court, not walking, but floating. The road to the port of Palos lay open before him. The wind seemed to whisper his name, Almirante. But the port of Palos was a place of superstitious sailors. They knew the sea better than the queen did. They knew the monsters that lurked in the deep. They knew that the wind only blew one way. To sail west was to slide down the curve of the earth. And how would a ship ever climb back up? Fear is a thick fog that hangs over the harbor. Columbus needed ships, and he needed men. But the men of Palos turned their backs on him. They looked at his white hair and saw a madman. He stood on the docks, watching the tide go out. He had the royal command, but he had no crew. The ship sat empty, bobbing sadly in the water. He needed allies, men of salt and iron. He needed the Pinzon brothers, the kings of the local coast. Martin Alonso Pinzon was a man of the sea, born to the rhythm of the waves. He walked the docks of Palos like a lion patrolling his territory. He knew every current, every sandbar, and every wind. Columbus knew he could not sail without this man's strong hand. They met in the quiet of the evening, away from the prying eyes. Pinzon looked at the maps with a sailor's sharp and critical eye. He did not see madness. He saw a challenge worthy of his name. "I will sail with you," Pinzon declared, his voice rough like gravel, "and I will bring the men of Palos to man your wooden walls." With Pinzon's word, the tide of fear began to turn. Sailors who had hidden in the shadows stepped forward into the light. They were rough men with faces tanned like old leather, men who knew how to tie a knot in the pitch black of a storm. And so the 3 ships were chosen to carry the weight of destiny. The Santa Maria, the flagship, heavy and slow and steady. She was a now, a beast of burden for the deep waters. Columbus would stand upon her high deck, looking out at the void. Then there was the Pinta, the painted one, fast and agile. Martin Alonso would captain her, with his brother at the helm, and the little Nina, small but brave, like a seabird. She was a caravel built to dance upon the surface of the waves. The harbor of Palos became a hive of restless activity. Barrels of fresh water rolled down the wooden planks with a hollow rumble. Sacks of hardtack, baked twice to survive the damp, were loaded. Jars of olive oil and salted meat filled the dark holds. The smell of tar and rope grew stronger in the summer heat. Carpenters hammered at the hulls, sealing the cracks with oakum. Every nail drove a little more hope into the heart of the admiral. But there was still a quiet fear lingering in the eyes of the crew. Mothers wept on the shore, clutching their rosary beads tight. They looked at the ships as if they were floating coffins. The priest walked among the men, blessing the wood and the canvas. Holy water sprinkled on the decks that would soon be soaked with spray. Columbus checked his manifest again and again. 90 men, 90 souls entrusted to his care. He touched the wood of the Santa Maria as if it were a living thing. "You will carry us," he whispered to the ship. "You will carry us to the gold and to the glory." The sun set on the final day, painting the sky in blood and violet. The ships bobbed gently, restless in their moorings. Tomorrow, the ropes would be cast off. Tomorrow, the land would be left behind. The church bells rang out, marking the hour of Compline. But few men slept soundly in the port of Palos that night. They lay awake, listening to the water lap against the stones, wondering if they would ever hear that familiar sound again. The horizon waited, a dark line drawn between the sea and the sky. It was a mouth waiting to swallow them whole, or a door waiting to be opened. The 3rd day of August, in the year of our Lord, 1492. The sky was still dark, a deep indigo velvet, but a faint line of gray was growing in the east. The dawn was coming, silent and inevitable. In the small church of St. George, the candles flickered low. Columbus knelt on the cold stone floor, his head bowed. He whispered his final prayers to the Virgin of Miracles. Beside him, his captains and pilots knelt in the shadows. They took the Holy Communion, the bread and the wine. It was a shield for their souls against the demons of the deep. They walked out into the cool morning air, solemn and quiet. The town was waking up, but the voices were hushed. The men climbed the gangplanks, their footsteps heavy on the wood. Ropes were cast off, splashing softly into the dark water. The command was given, not with a shout, but with a steady voice. "In the name of Jesus, Let go. The sails were unfurled, dropping down like heavy white curtains. The red cross of Castile, painted on the canvas, caught the first light. A gentle breeze, the terrell wind, blew from the land. It pushed them gently away from the safety of the shore. The ships began to move, cutting through the glassy harbor. They drifted past the sandbar of Saltese, the point of no return. The wooden hulls groaned, adjusting to the rhythm of the tide. Columbus stood at the stern, watching the land retreat. The monastery of La Rabida was a small white speck on the cliff. He raised his hand in a silent farewell to the monk who believed. The sun began to rise, painting the water in liquid gold. But the sailors did not look at the beauty of the light. They looked at the fading coastline of Spain. Their homes, their wives, their children were disappearing. Tears ran down rough cheeks, hidden by the turn of a head. Silence fell over the decks, heavier than the iron anchors. Only the creak of the rigging and the slap of the waves spoke. They were heading south first, towards the Canary Islands, to the Fortunate Isles at the edge of the known map. The sea was calm, welcoming them with a deceptive gentleness. The Pinta led the way, her sails bellied out and full. The Nina followed close, skipping like a stone on the water, and the Santa Maria, the slow mother, brought up the rear. Columbus opened his logbook, the pages crisp and white. He dipped his quill into the inkwell. I decided to write down everything, he wrote, to recount this voyage strictly from day to day. He was not just a sailor now. He was a chronicler of the New World. The land finally sank. Below the curve of the horizon, there was nothing left but the circle of the sea, blue above and blue below. And in the middle, 3 tiny chips of wood, floating on the breath of God. The sea is a mirror that reflects the soul of a ship. For 3 days, the wind was kind and the waters were smooth, but the ocean always tests the weak links first. On the 6th of August, a sharp crack echoed over the waves. It was the sound of wood snapping under invisible strain. The Pinta, the fastest of the 3, suddenly swerved. Her rudder had broken loose, drifting uselessly in the foam. Martin Alonso shouted orders, his voice fighting the wind. The ship wallowed like a wounded bird trying to fly. Columbus watched from the Santa Maria, his face tight with worry. He knew the owners of the Pinta, Rascon and Quintero. They had grumbled and complained before the voyage began. Was this an accident, or was it the dark hand of sabotage? A man's fear can drive him to break his own ship, to force a return to the safety of the known world. But Columbus was not a man to turn back so easily. They lashed the rudder with ropes, a temporary bandage. They limped forward toward the silhouette of the Canary Islands. The islands rose from the sea like jagged teeth of stone. Grand Canary and Gomera, volcanic and wild, they anchored in the calm waters, taking a breath of relief. The repair work began. Under the burning island sun, hammers rang out. Shaping new wood for the broken rudder, they changed the sails of the Nina from triangular to square, making her faster, ready to catch the trade winds. While they worked, the mountain of Teide woke up, a great volcano, spewing fire into the night sky. The sailors watched in terror, their eyes wide and white. They saw the flames as a warning from the gates of hell. God is angry, they whispered, clutching their chests. He forbids us to go further into the darkness. Columbus walked among them, calm and steady as a rock. It is only a mountain, he said gently. I have seen many such fires. In the lands of Italy. He turned their fear into wonder with soft words. He spoke of the Roman writers who saw the same sights. Slowly, the panic subsided like a tide going out. The ships were ready again, strong and tight. The water barrels were filled to the very brim. Fresh meat and wood were stored in the hold. On the 6th of September, they lifted the anchors once more. This was the true departure, the final severing of ties. They sailed past the island of Hierro, the last outpost. The familiar world was now truly behind them. The wind died down, leaving them drifting in silence. For 2 days, they barely moved on the oily water. It was a test of patience before the test of courage. Then the northeast trade winds began to breathe, filling the sails with a steady driving force, pushing them west into the endless, empty blue. The last gray shadow of land melted into the clouds. Now there was only the horizon, a perfect and terrifying circle. The sailors rushed to the stern, straining their eyes. When the land vanished, their courage vanished with it. A deep sigh went through the ship like a sudden wind. Grown men wept openly, tears falling onto the deck. They felt like orphans, abandoned in a watery wilderness. Columbus saw the panic rising like a dark tide. He knew he had to manage their minds as well as the ship. He went to his cabin, the small wooden box of secrets. He opened the logbook and made a fateful decision. He would keep 2 records of the distance they sailed, the true one. He kept hidden, locked in his chest. It showed the real speed, the rapid flight away from home, the false one. He announced to the crew every day. He cut the miles down, shrinking the ocean with his pen. We have sailed only 15 leagues, he lied softly, when in truth, they had sailed 20 or more. It was a white lie to keep the black fear at bay. The days began to blur into a rhythm of blue and gold. Time was measured not by clocks, but by sand. The ampolleta, the half-hour glass, sat on the binnacle. The fine sand trickled down, grain by grain. Every 30 minutes, the ship's boy turned it over. The glass is empty. He sang out in a high voice. The voyage continues, and the sand runs on. The sailors lived by these turns and by the prayers. At sunrise, they sang the Salve Regina. Their rough voices drifted over the empty waves. The ocean here was not like the sea they knew. It was a deep indigo purple, almost black, The weeds of the Sargasso began to appear. Strange, yellow berries floating in thick mats. At first, the men were happy to see the plants. Land must be near, they said with hopeful smiles. But the weeds did not stop. They stretched for miles, a meadow in the middle of the ocean, vast and silent. The ships plowed through the tangled green web, soft hissing sounds as the vegetation brushed the hull. Fear returned, wearing a new and strange mask. "The sea is freezing," one sailor whispered. "The weeds will trap us and hold us here forever." They imagined the ships stuck, rotting in the green slime. Columbus stood at the bow, watching the crabs in the weed. "These are river weeds," he said with confidence. "These are signs of life, not of death." He scooped up a crab and showed it to them. A tiny creature, living on a floating island. It was a small comfort in a world of immense doubt. But the wind kept blowing, pushing them west, always west, following the path of the setting sun. The weather was a blessing, soft and endlessly mild. Columbus wrote in his journal, with a touch of poetry, "The mornings are like April in Andalusia," he noted. "The only thing missing is the song of the nightingale." The sea was as smooth as the river in Seville. Breezes whispered secrets to the canvas sails. On the 14th of September, a bird appeared, a boatswain bird, with long white tail feathers. It circled the mast, crying out a lonely greeting. "It is a land bird," the sailors said to one another. "It does not sleep upon the waves." Hope flared up like a match struck in the dark. They scanned the western horizon until their eyes burned. Every cloud that sat low looked like a mountain. Every shadow on the water looked like an island. But as the sun sank, the shapes dissolved into mist. Disappointment settled heavy on their shoulders again. But the ocean held a stranger mystery than birds. On the night of the 13th, the pilots checked the course. They looked at the compass, the heart of the ship. The magnetic needle usually pointed true to the North Star, to Polaris, the unmoving nail of the heavens. But that night, the needle began to wander. It shifted, pointing to the northwest. The pilot stared at the binnacle in cold horror. The laws of nature were bending and breaking. "We are entering a new world," they whispered, "where the stars themselves are lost." Panic spread among the navigators, the men of science. If the compass failed, they were blind men in a void. They would never find the way back home. Columbus saw the fear in their trembling hands. He knew he had to explain the unexplainable. He could not admit that the magnetic pole was shifting. So he invented a reason right there in the dark. "The needle is true," he told them calmly. "It is the North Star that moves and circles the pole." He spoke with such authority that they believed him. He commanded the heavens with his words. The pilots nodded, their breathing slowing down. The panic receded, pushed back by his confidence. The needle was their god, and Columbus was its prophet. They sailed on, trusting in a painted piece of metal. On the 16th day, it began to rain softly, a gentle drizzle that washed the salt from the decks. The air smelled of moist earth, navigating the senses. Surely, land must be close now. The clouds hung low, heavy with promise, but the bow of the ship only cut through more water. Endless, infinite, mocking water. The eyes played tricks. When they stare too long at nothing, a bank of clouds resting on the water's edge can look exactly like a distant mountain range. On the evening of the 25th of September, the sun was setting behind a curtain of violet mist. Martin Alonso Pinzon stood on the high poop deck of the Pinta. He was restless, eager, always looking ahead. Suddenly, he shouted across the water. His voice cracked with the force of his excitement. "Land! Land! I claim the reward, sir!" The cry went through the fleet like a lightning bolt. Columbus ran to the stern, his heart hammering. He looked where Pinzon was pointing. There, in the dim light of dusk, a dark shape loomed against the dying sky. It looked solid. It looked real. Columbus fell to his knees on the hard wood. Tears streamed down his face once again. Gloria in excelsis Deo. He began to sing. His voice shook with relief and gratitude. The crew joined in, their voices rough and loud. 90 men singing in the middle of the ocean. The sound drifted up to the first appearing stars. The men of the Nina scurried up the masts like monkeys. They crowded the rigging, straining to see the prize. They were sure. They were absolutely sure. The ships changed course, steering toward the dark shape. They sailed all night, fueled by adrenaline. No one slept. No one could close their eyes. They waited for the sun to reveal the green shores. But the dawn is a cruel truth-teller. As the light crept over the eastern horizon, the dark shape began to soften and dissolve. It was not a mountain of earth and stone. It was a phantom, built of cloud and shadow. The wind blew it apart. Wisps of gray vapor. The disappointment was a physical blow to the stomach. The men slumped down, their energy drained away. The sea was empty again, flatter than before. The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive. It was a mirage, they muttered bitterly. The devil is mocking us, another whispered. Columbus stood up, dusting his knees. His face was pale, but his jaw was set hard. "We sail on," he said quietly. "The land is there, just beyond the mist." But the seeds of anger were beginning to sprout. The water supply was growing stale in the casks. The bread was turning hard and full of weevils, and the wind kept pushing them further from home. West, always west, into the unknown mouth. October arrived, bringing with it a colder light. The sea remained endless, a vast expanse of indifference. The disappointment of the false land hung over the ships like a shroud. It is harder to hope. A second time, the energy of the crew began to curdle into resentment. They looked at the horizon and saw only a prison wall. The water in the casks was now thick and foul-smelling. It tasted of rotten wood and stagnation. The men drank it with twisted faces, holding their breath. The hard biscuit, the lifeblood of the voyage, was crumbling. It was alive with small black beetles. They ate in the dark, so they would not see what they swallowed. Hunger is a slow acid that eats away at discipline. The voices on the deck grew lower and harder. They no longer sang hymns at the setting of the sun. Instead, there were whispers in the shadows of the sails. Knots of men gathered, leaning close together. Their eyes would dart toward the stern, where Columbus stood. They did not see an admiral anymore. They saw a foreigner, a mad Genoese, who had tricked them into sailing off the edge of the earth. He is lost, one sailor muttered, spitting into the sea. He is chasing a dream that will kill us all. The fear of falling off the world was replaced by a new fear, the fear of never returning home. They calculated the days and the remaining food. The math was simple and terrifying. If they did not turn back now, today, they would starve before they ever saw Spain again. The wind, once their friend, was now their enemy. It blew relentlessly from the east, pushing them further into the void. How will we ever sail back against this? They asked. The pilots shook their heads, unable to answer. The Santa Maria became a vessel of conspiracy. The tension was thick enough to taste in the salt air. It felt like the heavy, electric silence before a thunderstorm. Columbus felt the eyes upon his back, cold and sharp as daggers. He knew the smell of mutiny better than the smell of land. He walked the deck alone, wrapped in his red cloak. He maintained a facade of absolute, unshakable calm. But inside, his own doubts were beginning to whisper. Had he miscalculated the size of the ocean? Was the world truly so much larger than he dreamed? He spent hours in his cabin, staring at his charts, recalculating the figures until his eyes blurred. He had to find something to give them hope, or they would take the ship and throw him to the waves. The 10th of October dawned, gray and sullen. The breaking point had finally arrived. The men came to him, not as sailors, but as a mob. They stood before him, a wall of angry faces. The captains of the other ships were there too. Martin Alonso Pinzon looked at the admiral with cold eyes. "The men can take no more," he said bluntly. "We are sailing to our deaths in this endless water." The words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Columbus looked at them, studying the fear in their souls. He saw the knuckles white on the hilts of their knives. He knew that logic would no longer work. He could not talk of maps or degrees or calculations. He had to speak to their hearts and their greed. "We have come too far," he said. his voice steady and low. To turn back now would be the greatest failure of all. He stepped closer to them, shrinking the distance. Think of the gold, he whispered softly. Think of the silk and the pearls that await us. Do you want to return to Spain as beggars or as lords, rich beyond your wildest dreams? A murmur went through the crowd, a ripple of hesitation. Greed is a powerful fire must to fight the ice of fear, but the anger was still there, simmering just below the surface. Give me 3 days, Columbus said suddenly. It was a gamble, a final desperate throw of the dice. Just 3 more days of sailing west. If we do not find land by then, he paused, letting the silence stretch out. If we do not find land, we will turn the ships around. The men looked at each other, weighing the offer. 3 days was a lifetime in this empty world, but it was a finite time, a measurable end. Pinzon nodded slowly, his face grim and set. 3 days, he repeated, locking eyes with Columbus. And not an hour more. The deal was struck. Sealed with a nod and a spit, the mob dispersed, dissolving back into the shadows. But the air remained thick. With the promise of violence, Columbus turned back to the sea, his hands gripping the rail. He had bought time, but he had sold his safety now. The ocean had to answer him. The sun began to dip, painting the water in blood. The night of the 10th fell like a heavy curtain. The wind picked up, blowing harder than before. The ships surged forward, racing against the clock. Every hour that passed was a grain of sand lost. Columbus did not sleep. He could not afford to blink. He stood at the stern, a statue of pure will, watching the waves crash against the wooden hull, praying for a sign, any sign that the world was not infinite after all, that there was an end to the blue abyss. The sun rose on the 11th of October, the first day of the deadline. The wind was blowing strong, fresher than ever before. The sea was rising, choppy and rough with whitecaps. The ships were flying, tearing through the foam. They were making 12 knots, a dangerous speed for the dark. But no one dared to lower the sails. They were racing toward destiny or toward destruction. Then the ocean began to speak to them, not with words, but with small, floating treasures. The sailors on the Pinta saw a cane floating in the water, a green reed recently cut from the earth. It was not a weed of the deep. It was a child of the land. Hearts began to beat faster in tired chests. Then the crew of the Niña saw something even better, a small branch covered in fresh red berries. It looked like a garland woven by the wind. They fished it out with a trembling net. The berries were plump. They had not rotted in the salt. But the greatest sign came to the Santa Maria. A piece of wood drifted past the hull. They hauled it on deck, dripping and dark. Columbus held it up to the light of the sun. It was not raw timber, torn from a tree by a storm, it was carved, shaped by an iron tool, a stick worked by human intelligence. The mutiny evaporated like mist in the morning sun. Anger turned into a feverish, electric anticipation. Someone is there, they whispered in awe. Just beyond the waves, someone is waiting. The sun began to set. On the 11th day, the sea turned a deep, ominous purple. But the wind did not die down. It roared. The ships surged forward into the pitch-black night. Columbus ordered a special watch, doubling the lookouts. Keep your eyes peeled, he commanded the men. The first man to see land will receive a silken doublet and 10,000 maravedis from the queen herself. No one slept in the fleet that night. 87 pairs of eyes stared into the dark, straining to separate the black water from the black sky. The moon rose late, casting a pale, ghostly road on the waves. It was nearly 10 o'clock, the hour of silence. Columbus stood on the stern castle, alone in the wind. The salt spray stung his face like cold needles. He looked west, piercing the veil of the night, and then he saw it. Or did he just imagine it? A tiny, flickering spark in the void, like a wax candle rising and falling. He rubbed his eyes, afraid to trust his own senses. Was it a star, dipping low into the ocean? Or was it a fire, burning on a distant shore? He called out softly to Pedro Gutierrez, a gentleman of the king's bedchamber, standing nearby. "Look there," Columbus whispered, pointing into the blackness. "Tell me what you see right above the horizon." Gutierrez squinted, leaning over the damp rail. "I see a light," he said, his voice trembling, like a small wax candle rising and falling. They called another witness, Rodrigo Sanchez, but by the time he came, the light had vanished. Had it been a ghost, an illusion of the mind? Then it flickered again. Just for a second, it moved, as if someone was carrying a torch, walking along a beach, or fishing in a canoe. Columbus felt a shiver run down his spine. It was the first sign of human life. But they did not shout. They did not cheer. They had been wrong before, and the pain was too great. They kept the secret, holding it tight in their chests. The ships raced on under the bright white moon. It was 2 hours past midnight. The 12th of October had officially begun. The Pinta was far ahead, a gray ghost in the moonlight. On her forecastle stood Rodrigo de Triana, a lookout, with eyes sharp as a hawk. He was looking at a dark patch on the horizon. It did not move. It did not dissolve. It grew larger and whiter and solid. It was a cliff illuminated by the moon. "Tierra," he screamed, with all the air in his lungs. "Tierra! Tierra!" The cry rang out. The captain of the Pinta ordered the cannon fired. Boom! The sound shattered the silence of the ocean. A puff of smoke rose silver in the night air. It was the signal. the promise kept on the Santa Maria. Columbus heard the shot. He fell to his knees, weeping openly now. The heavy chains of fear fell away from his heart. The crew came running, embracing each other. It is true, they sobbed. We are saved. The order was given to shorten the sails. The ships turned their heads into the wind. They lay to, drifting gently off the coast, waiting for the curtain of night to lift. It was the longest wait of their lives. They could smell the land now, sweet and green. The scent of unknown flowers drifted over the water. They were anchored at the doorstep of a new world. Friday morning, the 12th of October, the sun lifted the gray veil of the night, and there it lay, drifting on the turquoise sea, an island, green and bright as an emerald jewel. The trees were tall, touching the morning sky. Fruits hung heavy, like colorful lanterns in the leaves. It was a garden, floating in the middle of the ocean. The sailors stared, their mouths open in silent wonder. The nightmare of the endless void was finally over. They saw figures moving on the pristine white sand, naked and unashamed, like Adam in the first Eden. Columbus put on his finest clothes. For this holy moment, a doublet of scarlet wool, bright as fresh blood. He took the royal standard, the heavy flag of Castile. The lions and castles danced in the gentle trade wind. The captains, Martin Alonso and his brother Vicente, took the banners of the Green Cross for the king and queen. They lowered the armed boat into the crystal clear water. The splash was soft, a welcoming sound of arrival. They climbed down, leaving the large wooden ships behind. The oars dipped, cutting the glass-like surface rhythmically. 1, 2, 1, 2, closer and closer to the unknown shore. The water was so transparent they could see the bottom, white sand rippled by the ancient currents, colorful fish darting away from the shadow of the boat. The air was warm, like a soft and humid embrace. The smell of strange flowers was overpowering and sweet. The keel of the boat finally scraped against the sand, a gritty sound marking the end of the journey. Columbus stood up, unsteady for a moment on his legs. He was the first to step off the floating wood and onto the solid, warm, real earth. He fell to his knees immediately upon the beach. He kissed the ground with tears streaming from his eyes. The sand stuck to his lips, a gritty taste of victory. He thanked God for the solid world beneath him. The other captains knelt beside him in the surf. Rough men, humbled by the miracle of survival, they wept openly, embracing the admiral's feet, asking for forgiveness for their doubts and their anger. The wind rustled the palm fronds high overhead, a natural applause for their impossible journey. Columbus stood tall and drew his sword from its sheath, not to fight, but to claim the moment. He named the island San Salvador, Holy Savior, for it had saved them all from the deep. The natives watched from the edge of the dense trees, silent, curious, and full of a quiet fear. Two worlds were about to touch for the first time. The trees parted like a green curtain revealing a stage. The people of the island stepped out into the sunlight. They did not carry iron swords or heavy wooden shields. They held only simple spears, tipped with dry fish teeth. Their bodies were painted in strange and vibrant patterns. Some were painted black, others white as milk, and many were red, the color of the earth itself. They were young, with strong and well-built limbs. Their hair was coarse, thick like the tail of a horse, falling short over their eyebrows, but long in the back. They looked at the bearded strangers with wide, dark eyes. Are these men gods falling from the morning sky, or are they monsters risen from the sea foam? Columbus watched them with a calculating gaze. He saw no weapons. He saw no malice. They are a people. He wrote later in his journal, who would be better freed by love than by force? He reached into his pouch and pulled out small treasures, bright red caps made of cheap woolen cloth, strings of glass beads that sparkled in the sun. To the sailors, these were trinkets of no value, but to the islanders, they were diamonds and rubies. They took the gifts with trembling, eager hands, laughing with delight at the colors and the light. In return, they brought their own precious things, balls of spun cotton, white as snow clouds, parrots with feathers of brilliant green and blue. They swam out to the boats, holding the gifts high, a bridge of commerce built on pure curiosity. Columbus looked closely at their faces and ears. He was not looking for beauty. He was looking for gold. He saw small pieces hanging from their noses, a tiny glint of yellow against the dark skin. His heart skipped a beat deep in his chest. He asked them with signs where the gold came from. He pointed to the metal and then to the horizon. They gestured vaguely to the south and the west, to a land where a king drank from golden cups. The hunger in Columbus woke up again. He was in Eden, but he was looking for the mine. The island was beautiful beyond all words. No man could ever tire, he whispered softly, of looking at such verdant green. But beauty alone could not pay the queen's debts. He spent the day exploring the calm lagoon. The water was a garden of coral and light. He saw fish that rivaled the birds in color, but the shadow of greed was already stretching out. He ordered the sails to be set once more. He would take 6 of these men as guides. The ships pulled away from the white sands of San Salvador. 6 of the island men stood upon the wooden deck. They looked back at their home, shrinking into the distance. Their eyes were wide, reflecting the fear of the unknown. They did not know they were sailing into history's pages. They thought they were going to the land of the sky gods. Columbus stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sea here was not empty. It was crowded with jewels. Islands appeared everywhere, green dots on a blue canvas. There are so many, he wrote with a shaking hand. I do not know where to go first. He felt like a man lost in a labyrinth of beauty. He steered toward the largest one, looming in the mist. He named it Santa Maria de la Concepcion, honoring the Virgin, who had watched over his sleep. The coast was rugged, but the trees were magnificent, tall and straight, piercing the humid air. The sailors rowed ashore, searching for fresh water. They found hidden springs, cool and sweet, but they did not find the mines of gold. The natives here wore the same simple innocence. They offered cotton and broken pieces of pottery. Columbus accepted them with a polite but impatient smile. He touched the gold hanging from their ears. Where? He asked with gestures. Where is the source? They pointed again, further south, further west, to an island they called Fernandina. The fleet raised the anchors, chasing the rumor. The wind was light, barely filling the heavy canvas. The water was so clear, it felt like flying on air. They could see the shadow of the hull on the sand below. On Fernandina, the wonders grew deeper. They saw trees that looked like nothing in Spain, branches that rooted themselves back into the earth, flowers and fruits growing on the same trunk. The air smelled of mastic and aromatic resins, a perfume that made the head spin with delight. The sailors saw a beast resting on a rock, a serpent with feet looking like a small dragon, an iguana watching them with cold, reptilian eyes. They killed it with a lance, for the skin was strange. But Columbus was not looking for dragons or trees. He was looking for the great Khan and his palaces. He was looking for the rooftops, tiled with pure gold. The guides whispered a name over and over. Kolba, they said, pointing to the dim horizon. Kolba, a land of greatness and riches. Columbus nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. It must be Chipangu. He told his captains confidently, it is the Japan that Marco Polo wrote of. He turned the prow of the Santa Maria toward the Phantom, leaving the small islands for the promise of an empire. On the 28th of October, the coast of Cuba appeared. It rose from the sea like a massive, dark wall. Mountains pierced the clouds, sharp and majestic. Columbus felt a surge of absolute certainty. This is it, he whispered to the wind. This is the mainland of the Grand Khan. The sheer size of the land overwhelmed the senses. Rivers flowed into the sea, deep and wide enough for ships. The forests were dense, a tangled wall of endless green. He named this land Juana for the Prince of Spain, but in his heart he called it Cathay. He anchored the ships in the mouth of a beautiful river. The water was cool and clear as liquid crystal. But where were the golden cities? Where were the busy ports? filled with silk merchants. There were only simple huts, thatched with dry palm leaves. The people fled, disappearing into the jungle like shadows. Columbus refused to let his dream die so easily. He chose two men to travel deep inland: Luis de Torres, a learned man who spoke Hebrew and Arabic, and Rodrigo de Jerez, a loyal and sturdy sailor. Go, Columbus commanded them with a wave of his hand. Find the king and give him this letter. He handed them a parchment tied with a royal ribbon. Bring back news of the gold and the spices. The two men walked into the green unknown. The waiting began again, silent and heavy on the soul. Columbus spent the days repairing the wooden ships. He walked the beaches, picking up shells and stones. He smelled the flowers, trying to identify Asian scents. "This must be cinnamon," he said, holding a piece of bark. But it was not cinnamon. It was only hope. Days passed, and the sun beat down relentlessly. Finally, the two envoys returned from the woods. They looked tired, their boots covered in thick mud. They did not carry bags of heavy gold. They did not bring a royal invitation from the emperor. "We found no city," Torres reported sadly. "Only a village of 50 simple houses. The people treated us like we were gods. They kissed our hands and our feet, but they know nothing of the great Khan." Columbus listened, his face a mask of stone, but the envoys brought back a strange curiosity. They saw men and women holding burning rolls of leaves, drinking the smoke deep into their bodies. It was a habit, strange and alien to Christian eyes. The smoke of tobacco drifting in the warm air. It was not gold, but it was a discovery all the same. Columbus turned back to the sea, disappointed but driven. He would not stop until he found the roof of gold. The anchors were lifted, dripping with the thick Cuban mud. The sails caught the wind. Breathing out like white lungs, they left the river of disappointment behind, turning their backs on the endless wall of green trees. The native guides were still with them, pointing east, whispering the name of a new island: Bohio, where gold was said to be gathered like pebbles on the beach. Greed is a compass that always points to the horizon, but greed can also divide. The strongest of alliances, Martin Alonso Pinzon, the wolf of the ocean sea, watched the admiral with growing impatience and distrust. Why follow this dreamer, who finds only smoke and leaves? The wind turned favorable. On the 21st of November, a strong breeze, blowing hard from the west. The Pinta was fast, a greyhound unleashed on the water. Without a word of warning, she changed her course. She pulled ahead, her sails bellied out and taut. Columbus shouted from the stern deck, his voice lost in the wind. He ordered signals fired, lanterns raised high in the night. But the Pinta did not slow down. She did not turn back. She became smaller and smaller, a speck against the rising moon, until she vanished completely, swallowed by the deep blue distance. betrayal is a bitter pill to swallow in solitude. Columbus felt the sting of it, sharp as a viper's tooth. "He has deserted me," he wrote in his journal that night, "driven by avarice and a heart full of disobedience." Now there were only two ships bobbing on the immense ocean, the heavy, slow-moving Mother, the Santa Maria, and the little Nina, faithful as a shadow. The mood on the decks deepened like the color of the water. They sailed for weeks through islands of breathtaking beauty, places where the sea was a garden of purple fans, and the air smelled of honey and ancient spices. But beauty does not fill the belly or satisfy the debt. On the 6th day of December, a new land appeared. It was vast, with high mountains kissing the clouds. It reminded Columbus of the lands of Castile in Spain, so he named it Española, the Spanish island. The anchor splashed down in a deep and protected harbor. It called it San Nicolas, for the saint of that holy day. The land here seemed richer, the soil darker and deeper. The trees were tall oaks and mighty pines. Fish played around the hull, silver and gold in the clear water, mullet and sole, just like the fish back home. It felt familiar, a comfort in a strange world. But the beaches were empty, silent, and waiting. Smoke rose from distant fires, hidden deep in the hills. The people here knew fear before they knew the strangers. Columbus stood on the deck, waiting for contact, hoping that this island held the key to the empire. For days, the jungle held its breath. The Spaniards walked on the beach, watched by unseen eyes. But on the 12th of December, the silence was finally broken. The sailors caught a young woman running through the trees. She was terrified, trembling like a trapped bird. She expected death, or something far worse. But Columbus was playing a long and careful game. He ordered her to be treated with the utmost gentleness. He gave her a shirt of European linen to cover her skin. He placed a string of glass beads around her neck, and he sent her back into the green shadows. It was a seed of trust, planted in the fertile soil, and it bore fruit, quicker than he dared to hope. The next day, the beach was crowded with people. They did not come with spears, but with smiles. They carried baskets of cassava bread, warm and white, and calabashes filled with fresh water, cool and sweet. The woman stood at the front, wearing her strange new clothes. She pointed to the bearded men and spoke of their kindness. The fear evaporated, replaced by a festive curiosity. Canoes surrounded the ships. Like a swarm of wooden fish, more than 1,000 souls came to see the men from heaven, and among them glinted the promise of the dawn. Small grains of gold held in open palms, masks with eyes and ears of beaten gold, shining in the sun. Columbus felt the fever rising in his blood once more. He traded cheap bells for the precious yellow metal, a hawk's bell for a nugget the size of a bean. It was robbery to the Spanish, but magic to the natives. for the sound of the bell was the voice of a metal spirit. The natives spoke a word that made Columbus freeze. Chibao, they said, pointing to the high central mountains. Chibao, where the gold is born in the rivers. To the admiral's eager ears, it sounded like Chipangu, the Japan of Marco Polo, the island of endless riches. He was sure of it now, absolutely sure. He was not on a wild island at the edge of the world. He was at the doorstep of the imperial city. He decided to meet the king of this golden land, a cacique named Guacanagari, a ruler of great dignity. Messengers ran back and forth along the sandy trails, carrying gifts of cloth and receiving gifts of gold. The Santa Maria prepared to sail closer to the king's village. It was the eve of Christmas, the holiest night of the year. The sea was calm, smooth as a polished mirror. The wind was barely a whisper, a gentle breath. The mood on the ship was relaxed and celebratory. The hard work seemed over. The reward was at hand. God had smiled upon them, or so they foolishly thought. But the sea never sleeps, and it never forgives, especially those who lower their guard in the dark. The sea was silent, a deceptive lullaby. Columbus's eyes were heavy, burned by the salt and sun. He had not slept for 2 days and a night. The water was like oil, motionless and thick. The ship is safe, he thought. Closing his weary eyes, he went to his cabin, surrendering to the dark. The master of the ship, Juan de la Cosa, saw the admiral leave. He yawned, stretching his arms to the stars. If the admiral sleeps, he reasoned, why shouldn't I? He called to a young boy, a grommet of 12 years. Take the tiller, he ordered, handing over the heavy wood. Keep her steady as she goes. It was a violation of the most sacred law of the sea. Never, ever leave the helm to a child. The boy stood there, proud but terrified, holding the life of the ship in his small hands. The current was invisible, a silent river under the sea. It grabbed the heavy hull and pulled it gently closer and closer to the roar of the breakers. The boy did not hear the water changing its song. He did not see the white foam in the darkness. Then a feeling, not a sound. A shudder ran through the timber like a beast waking up. Crack! The sound of oak grinding on coral. The tiller slammed, throwing the boy across the deck. He screamed, a high, piercing sound in the night. Almirante, master, we are struck. Columbus was on deck. In the blink of an eye, he did not need to see. He could feel the death of his ship. The Santa Maria was pinned on a sandbank. The waves began to lift her and slam her down. Again and again, a hammer on an anvil. Lower the boat! Columbus roared, his voice cutting the panic. Carry an anchor out. We must pull her off. Juan de la Cosa jumped into the boat with frightened men. But panic is a coward's master. They did not row the anchor out to save the ship. They rowed away, fleeing to the safety of the Nina. Columbus watched them go, with eyes full of betrayal. "Traitor!" he shouted, but the wind took his words. The Nina refused to let them board, sending them back in shame. But it was too late. For the heavy mother, the tide was dropping, leaving her stranded. Her seams opened up, letting the ocean in. The water rose in the hold, black and cold. The ship groaned, a dying animal's final breath. There would be no Christmas mass on this wooden floor, only the sorrow of a dream running aground. Columbus stood on the tilting deck, tears mixing with the spray. His flagship was gone, taken by a boy and a reef. The sun rose on a scene of wet desolation. The Santa Maria lay on her side, a broken skeleton. But in this moment of loss, a strange hand of friendship reached out. King Guacanagari sent all his people to help the strangers. They came with large canoes, gliding over the reef. They did not come to loot. They came to save. Every barrel of wine, every box of biscuits, every plank of wood was carried gently to the shore. Columbus watched in amazement at their honesty. Not a single lace point is missing. He wrote with wonder. The king himself came to the beach, weeping for the admiral's pain. He offered his own houses to store the goods. He offered gold to dry the tears of the white man. And in that gold, Columbus saw the hand of God. He looked at the small Nina bobbing in the distance. She was too small to carry all the men back to Spain. If the Santa Maria had not sunk, they would all have left. It is a sign, Columbus declared, his eyes shining. God wants us to stay here, to plant a colony. The wreck was not a disaster. It was a foundation. The order was given to strip the ship to its bones. The carpenters took their axes, and the air filled with noise. The sturdy oak planks that had crossed the ocean would now become the walls of the first fortress. They dug a ditch and built a tower of wood. They named the place Villa de la Navidad, the town of the Nativity. Born on Christmas Day, the mood of the men changed from fear to excitement. They were not castaways. They were the first lords of the land. They would stay behind while Columbus sailed for help. 39 men were chosen to hold the fort. Diego de Arana would be their captain. They would trade for gold until the ships returned. They would find the mines and fill the storehouse. You will be rich men, Columbus promised them. When I return, we will share a ton of gold. The king gave them food and promised his protection. It seemed like a paradise, safe and warm. No one saw the shadow hanging over the fort, the shadow of greed that would turn friends into enemies. The fortress rose quickly, stark against the palm trees, a piece of Europe hammered into the tropical soil. Cannons were mounted, pointing out to the sea, not to fight the natives, but to signal the return. Columbus embraced the men, one by one. Trust in God, he whispered, and trust in the king. He did not know he was saying goodbye forever. He would never see a single one of them alive again. The Nina was ready, heavy with water and wood. The wind was calling for the long journey home. The dream of the East was now a settlement in the West. On the 4th of January, in the year 1493, the Nina raised her anchor. From the sandy bottom, she turned her prow away from the tragic fortress. The 39 men stood on the wall, waving their arms. Their voices drifted across the water, faint and lonely. "God be with you," they shouted into the wind. Columbus waved back, a heavy knot in his chest. He was leaving them at the edge of the known universe. The little caravel sailed east, hugging the coast. She was alone now, a solitary bird on the water, but the sea is full of surprises. 2 days later, near a high mountain shaped like a tent, the lookout shouted, pointing to the east. A white sail was coming toward them against the wind. It was the Pinta, the lost sheep returning to the flock. Martin Alonso Pinzon came aboard the admiral's ship. The meeting was tense, filled with unspoken words. Pinzon spoke of bad winds and being blown off course. He did not speak of the gold he had found. He did not speak of the rivers he had secretly explored. Columbus listened, his face calm and unreadable. He knew it was a lie, but he needed the ship. "It is God's will," he said simply, ending the quarrel. A divided fleet could not survive the Atlantic winter. Together again, they sailed to a wide bay, the Bay of Arrows, where the reception was not warm. The men here were different, fierce and proud. Their faces were stained with charcoal, black as night. Their hair was long, tied in nets of parrot feathers. They held bows of strong wood and heavy arrows. When the Spanish landed, the air grew tight. A trade began, but it turned sour and sharp. A native raised his bow. The string pulled tight. A Spanish sword flashed. In the bright sunlight, blood was spilled onto the white sand, the first drop of red in a long history of war. The natives fled, vanishing into the thick woods. Columbus called his men back, shaking his head. "We must leave," he said. "The wind is turning." He did not want war. He wanted the wind. On the 16th of January, they turned their backs on land. They aimed their bows into the open, empty north. They were going home, but the ocean was waiting. The smooth seas of the journey out were gone. Winter had settled over the Atlantic. The waves were gray and cold and steep. The ships climbed them like weary mountaineers, groaning under the strain of the shifting tides. The food was low, the water was stale, but the hope of return kept their hearts warm. They were sailing into the mouth of the storm. For weeks, the Atlantic was a sleeping giant. They made good time, pushed by the westerlies. The pilots charted a course, arguing about the stars. But the sea keeps its own counsel. On the 12th of February, the sky turned a bruised purple. The wind shifted, screaming from the southwest. The waves rose up, higher than the masts. They were not waves anymore. They were moving hills of water. The Nina, without her ballast, was light and unstable. She was tossed like a cork in a boiling cauldron. The Pinta, struggling against the gale, began to drift away. Pinzon lit flares, bright red fires in the chaotic night. Columbus answered, with lanterns swinging wildly, but the wall of rain and the mountain of water separated them. The lights flickered and then were gone. The Nina was alone in the belly of the beast. We are lost. The sailors cried, huddled on the wet deck. God is punishing us for our pride. Lightning tore the sky open, illuminating the terror. Columbus stood at the helm, soaked and freezing. He was not afraid of death for himself. He was afraid that the secret would die with him if the ship sank. The world would never know. They would think he was just another fool, lost at sea. The Queen would never get her return on the investment. He went to his cabin, stumbling as the floor tilted crazy. He took a sheet of parchment and wrote with frantic speed. He wrote of the islands, the people, and the gold. He wrapped the paper in a waxed cloth and placed it inside a large wooden cake barrel. He sealed it tight with hoops and tar. If we perish, he whispered to the wood, you must survive to tell the tale. He threw the barrel into the raging sea. The sailors watched, thinking it was an act of devotion, a sacrifice to calm the angry waters. They did not know it was a message in a bottle, addressed to the future and to the king. Then they turned to spiritual bargains. They brought out a bowl filled with dried chickpeas. One pea was marked with a cross cut by a knife. They drew lots, shaking the bowl with trembling hands. Whoever picked the crossed pea would make a pilgrimage to the shrine of Santa Maria de Guadalupe. Carrying a candle, Columbus put his hand in and pulled out the marked pea. He was the chosen one, the bearer of the burden. He vowed to walk in his shirt to the holy shrine. If only the Virgin would calm the wind. The storm raged on for 3 endless days. They ate nothing. They slept not a wink. They only held on and prayed for the morning. On the morning of the 15th, the gray curtain lifted. It was not the warm coast of Spain, nor the gold of the Indies. It was a rock jutting out of the angry Atlantic, the island of Santa Maria in the Azores. Portuguese soil, ruled by a suspicious hand, they steered the battered Nina toward the shelter of the cove. The anchor dropped, holding fast to the bottom. Relief washed over them, cold and exhausting. But this was not a safe harbor. It was a trap. Columbus remembered the vow made in the storm. He ordered half the crew to go ashore to walk in procession to the small stone chapel, to pray to the Virgin in their simple white shirts. They rode to the beach, trembling with gratitude. They entered the holy house, kneeling on the floor. But while their heads were bowed, the doors burst open. Soldiers appeared, with swords drawn and ready. The governor of the island, a man named Castaneda. He did not see pilgrims. He saw pirates. He ordered them seized and thrown into chains on the Nina. Columbus waited, watching the shore. The hours passed, and the boat did not return. He paced the deck, his anxiety turning to anger. He saw the movement of troops on the distant rocks. He realized the treachery, and his blood ran cold. He shouted across the water, holding up his parchment, "I am the Admiral of the Ocean Sea." He roared, "Release my men, or I will bring fire to your town." The governor laughed from the safety of the dunes. "We know no Queen of Castile here," he shouted back. "This is the land of the King of Portugal." The standoff lasted for 3 tense days. The wind blew again, threatening to smash the ship. Columbus had to cut his cables and flee to the open sea. He sailed around the island, nursing his fury. He returned when the weather broke, his cannons ready. He threatened to bombard the port into dust. The governor, seeing the resolve in the admiral's eyes, or perhaps fearing the wrath of Spain, finally relented. He released the prisoners, hungry and shaken. They rowed back to the ship, eager to be gone. The anchor was raised. Dripping with the Atlantic mud, they fled the Azores, escaping the Portuguese net. But the ocean was not done with them yet. Another storm was brewing, darker than the first. A cyclone, waiting to catch them off the coast of Lisbon. The sky turned black, as if the sun had died. The wind screamed, tearing the sails into ribbons. "It is the devil," the sailors cried, "trying to stop us." They were being pushed straight toward the rocky cliffs, toward the crushing teeth of the Sintra Mountains. The storm was a wall of noise and driving rain. The coast of Portugal was a line of white foam and death. The sailors prepared their souls for the final crash. But Columbus stood firm, his hands bleeding on the wheel. He saw a gap in the churned white water, the mouth of the Tagus River, the gateway to Lisbon. It was a desperate gamble to sail into the rival's den, but the alternative was to be smashed against the cliffs. With a prayer on his lips, he turned the helm hard. The Nina surfed down a massive wave, shuddering violently. She shot through the entrance like a stone from a sling. Suddenly, the roar of the ocean fell behind them. They were in the river, calm and gray and safe. It was the 4th of March in the morning light. They dropped the anchor off the village of Restelo. The people of Lisbon ran to the water's edge. They stared at the battered little ship. With awe, "They have returned from the dead." The crowd whispered, "No ship has ever survived a winter like this." But the danger was not over. It had only changed shape. A large warship, the Bartholomew, approached them. Her captain was no ordinary man. He was Bartholomew Diaz, the great explorer, who had rounded the Cape of Good Hope. He rowed to the Nina. With a stern and cold face, he ordered Columbus to come aboard the Portuguese ship, to surrender himself to the king's justice. But Columbus, emboldened by his discovery, refused. "I am the admiral of the sovereigns of Castile," he declared. "I do not leave my ship for any man." He showed his commission, the royal seal of Spain. Diaz looked at the parchment and then at the man. He saw the fire in Columbus's eyes and the gold on the natives. He lowered his sword and bowed with respect. The news spread like wildfire through the streets of Lisbon. "The Genoese has found the Indies," the criers shouted. The King of Portugal, John II, summoned him, the same king who had rejected him years ago. Columbus traveled to the Valley of Paraíso, to the royal court. It was a moment of supreme triumph and supreme danger. The king listened to the story, his face pale with regret. He saw the Indians with their gold masks. He saw the samples of cotton and strange beans. "Why did I let this slip?" the king thought bitterly. His courtiers whispered, dark poison in his ear. "Kill him now," they hissed softly. "Bury the secret here and claim the land for yourself." The king looked at Columbus, weighing the murder in his mind. The room was silent, heavy with the scent of intrigue. Columbus stood tall, surrounded by his enemies. He knew that one wrong word would be his last. But the king, fearing the wrath of Isabella, hesitated. "Go," he said finally, waving his hand wearily. "Go back to your queen and tell her what you have done." The anchors of the Niña were lifted for the last time. She slipped out of the Tagus River on the 13th of March. The wind was gentle now, carrying them softly home. The nightmare of the winter storms was finally over. Columbus stood at the prow, smelling the sweet air of Spain. Every mile was a victory lap. Every wave was applause on the 15th of March. Shortly after noon, the familiar sandbar of Saltes appeared in the mist. The port of Palos lay waiting in the spring sun. It had been 7 months and 12 days since they had sailed away into the great unknown. The tide carried them in, crossing the shallow bar. The people on the shore stopped their work. They shaded their eyes, looking at the lone ship. "It is the Niña," someone shouted. "They are alive." The cry went up, ringing through the narrow streets. Church bells began to peal wildly and joyfully. Mothers ran to the harbor, weeping with relief. The sailors stepped off the ship. Like men returning from the moon, they were thin and weathered and scarred. But their eyes held the light of a new world. Columbus walked to the church of St. George to pray, the same stones where he had knelt in fear. Now heard his whispers of overwhelming gratitude, but the drama was not quite finished. Just a few hours later, as the sun began to dip, another sail appeared on the western horizon. It was the Pinta, the lost sister. She had missed the storm that trapped the Niña. Martin Alonso Pinzon guided her into the port. He expected to be the first to tell the news. He expected to be the hero. of the voyage. But as he saw the Nina anchored safely in the mud, his heart broke. Inside his chest, the admiral had beaten him. One last time, Pinzon did not go ashore to meet the cheering crowds. He was sick, with a fever of the body and soul. He had his men row him secretly to his farm, to a quiet house, away from the noise of victory. He climbed into his bed, pulling the sheets up high. The man who had saved the voyage was dying. He would never hear the praise of the Queen. He would never see the maps redrawn. While Columbus bathed in the light of glory, Pinzon faded into the shadows of history. It is the cruel price of ambition. Two men went to the same world and saw the same things, but only one would wear the crown of fame. Columbus prepared his letter for the sovereigns. Barcelona was waiting, and the road was open. The journey to Barcelona was not a mere travel. It was the triumphal march of a Roman conqueror. Columbus moved through the dusty heart of Spain, and the country woke up to see the impossible. Rumors flew ahead of him, faster than the swiftest horse. He has found the Garden of Eden, the peasants whispered. He has found the lost mines of King Solomon. In every village, the bells rang out wildly. People poured out of their houses, abandoning their work. They lined the roads, standing shoulder to shoulder. They did not look at the admiral in his fine clothes. They looked at the wonders he brought from the deep. The 6 natives walking with silent dignity, their bodies painted, their feathers bright as jewels. They carried cages filled with screaming parrots, birds of green and red that had never been seen in Europe. Sailors carried trays covered in velvet cloth, holding masks of gold that grinned at the crowd, strange fruits that smelled of pineapple and decay. It was a circus of the unknown, passing through the mundane. The air was thick with the dust of thousands of feet and the electric buzz of a world being rewritten. They arrived at the gates of Barcelona in mid-April. The city was a hive of banners and trumpets. The king and queen waited in the Plaza del Rey. They did not sit in the shadows of a stone hall. They sat out in the open under a canopy of gold cloth. The sun shone down on the union of Castile and Aragon. Columbus approached the throne through a sea of people. He did not walk with the stoop of a petitioner. He walked with the stride of the admiral of the ocean sea. His white hair shone like a silver crown. He climbed the steps toward the monarchs who believed. He knelt to kiss their hands, a gesture of fealty. But then a miracle of etiquette occurred. The king and queen rose from their heavy chairs. They lifted him up with their own royal hands. They offered him a seat right beside them. Don Cristobal, Isabella said, her voice trembling. The weaver's son was now a peer of the realm. He signaled to his men, and the show began. The gold was poured out, clattering onto the silver plates. The natives stepped forward, bowing low to the strange gods. The courtiers gasped, covering their mouths with lace. This was not a story spun by a madman. This was flesh and blood and heavy yellow metal. The map of the world shattered in that moment. The Atlantic was no longer an endless prison wall. It was a bridge spanning the impossible distance, and Columbus held the only key. The choir began to sing the Te Deum Laudamus. The sound rose up, mixing with the seagulls' cries. The news did not stay within the walls of the palace. It spread outward like ripples in a pond, riding on the backs of horses and the decks of ships. The printing presses began to clatter and hum. Columbus's letter was copied again and again. It flew to Rome, to Paris, to London. Men in distant universities adjusted their spectacles, reading the words with disbelief and wonder. A new world. They whispered in dusty libraries. The ancients were wrong. The ocean has a far shore. The Pope himself, Alexander VI, took a map and a pot of dark ink. He drew a line straight down the Atlantic, dividing the globe like a ripe orange. To the west belonged to Spain. To the east belonged to Portugal. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. Two kings dividing the earth with a stroke of a pen. But Columbus was already looking back to the sea. He was not a man to sit still in velvet chairs. The fever of the return was burning in his veins. But this time it would be different. There would be no begging for leaky ships. There would be no emptying of jails for reluctant crews. All of Spain wanted to sail with the admiral. Knights sold their armor to buy a place on the deck. Priests left their altars to save heathen souls. Farmers left their fields, dreaming of gold nuggets. They gathered in the port of Cadiz, a massive army. Not 3 small ships, but 17 great vessels. 1,500 men clamoring to get on board. Horses, cattle, sheep, and seeds. It was not an exploration. It was an exodus. Columbus stood on the bridge of the Maria Galante. He looked at the forest of masts swaying in the harbor. He felt the weight of a godlike power. He had left as a nobody, a ghost in a threadbare cloak. He was returning as the Viceroy of the Indies. The water in the harbor teemed with small boats, carrying supply and weeping families. The noise was deafening, a roar of ambition. But in the quiet corners of his own mind, Columbus remembered the silence of the first voyage, the purity of the empty horizon, the simple fear and the simple hope. Now, complications were boarding the ships with him. Greed, envy, bureaucracy, and law. The Garden of Eden was about to be trampled by the heavy boots of civilization. The sun rose on the 25th of September in the year of 1493. The signal cannon fired, shaking the birds from the roofs. The sails unfurled, a white avalanche of canvas. The grand fleet began to move, turning its face toward the setting sun, ready to consume the paradise found. The ocean passage was swift and efficient, but the heart of the admiral was anxious. He thought constantly of the 39 men left behind in the wooden fortress of Navidad. Did they have mountains of gold waiting, or had the silence of the jungle swallowed them? They sighted the islands of the Caribs, beautiful but dangerous lands of rumor, but the fleet did not stop for long. They pushed on with a singular purpose toward the northern coast of Hispaniola. It was late in the month of November when they anchored off the familiar beach. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long purple shadows on the water. But something was immediately wrong. There was no thin line of smoke rising. There was no Spanish flag waving in the breeze. There was no shout of welcome from the shore. Only the rhythmic sound of the waves and the lonely cry of the seabirds. A terrible, heavy silence hung over the bay. Columbus ordered a cannon to be fired. Boom! The sound rolled over the green hills. He waited for a return signal from the fort. He waited for the crack of a musket. But the jungle remained stubbornly silent. Not even a bird stirred in the trees. Fear gripped the throat of every sailor. They waited for the dawn in the boats. A long, sleepless, haunted night. In the gray light of the morning, they rowed slowly to the quiet shore. Columbus stepped onto the sand once more, but the greeting was only ashes. The fortress of La Navidad was gone. It was a blackened, burnt ruin. Charred timbers lay scattered on the ground. The heavy chests of trade goods were smashed open and completely empty. And the men, his loyal crew, the 39 guardians of the New World, were nowhere to be found alive. Only rags and bones remained in the grass. Greed had devoured them from the inside. They had fought violently among themselves, and they had angered the people of the land. The dream of a peaceful paradise was stained with blood forever. Columbus stood amidst the wreckage of his hope. He realized then that the new world had teeth. The innocent dream was gone like smoke in the wind, but the bridge across the ocean could never be broken. Columbus turned away from the ashes of failure. He marched east, fighting the wind and the sorrow. He founded a new city, La Isabela, built of stone and sweat and the iron will of empire. The path was open now, for better or for worse. Ships would come by the hundreds and the thousands, bringing horses and wheat and the cross, and taking back gold and silver and potatoes. The two halves of the world were sewn together with a thread of courage and a needle of pain. Christopher Columbus, the weaver's son from Genoa, had achieved the impossible. Driven by a voice in his head, he died years later in the quiet city of Valladolid, still believing he had found the coast of Asia. He never knew the true magnitude of what he had done. He never knew he had found a hemisphere. But tonight, we leave the maps behind. We leave the ships anchored in a harbor of history. The sails are furled, resting against the masts. The cannons are cold and silent in the dark. The wind has died down to a gentle whisper. The ocean is calm, a flat sheet of liquid glass. It is time to step off the deck. It is time to leave the year 1492. Let the centuries drift away like mist. Let the weight of the past slide off your shoulders. You have sailed far tonight, my brave traveler. You have crossed the dark sea and returned safely. Now, the only horizon left is the horizon of sleep. Close your eyes and let the darkness hold you, warm and soft and endlessly deep. There are no storms here in this quiet place, only the slow, steady rhythm of your breathing in and out, like the tide washing over the white sand, drifting, floating, sinking down into the velvet embrace of the night. The story is over, but your rest is just beginning. Sleep now with the peace of a calm sea. Dream of new worlds waiting to be found. Good night, my friend. Good night, and voyage safely into the beautiful, unknown darkness, silence, peace.